I'm the Avatar. It's my destiny to—
Destiny? What would a boy know of destiny? If a fish lives its whole life in this river, does he know the river's destiny? No!
Aang isn't the last airbender. Hidden like air currents, invisible to the eye, clues throughout the show reveal this startling truth. After analyzing every episode multiple times, I've found compelling evidence that other airbenders survived the genocide, concealed in background details, throwaway lines, and unexplained phenomena. In a world where bending abilities can skip generations or appear randomly, doesn't it seem suspicious that no airbending appeared anywhere for 100 years? The Fire Nation's attack was devastating, but could it truly eliminate an entire elemental ability from the world? Today I'm going to show you 3 major theories about how other airbenders survived, and all the evidence that supports each one. But wait, have you ever wondered why the Fire Nation kept searching for airbenders long after they supposedly wiped them all out? I mean, think about it. If they truly believed they had eliminated every single airbender except the Avatar, why would they continue an extensive hunt for decades? When we examine Fire Lord Sozin's military strategies after the initial attack on the air temples, something doesn't add up. He dedicated significant resources to finding airbenders, which makes absolutely no sense unless he knew some had escaped. The evidence throughout the series points to a deliberate, ongoing hunt. The Fire Nation maintained elaborate traps specifically designed to capture airbenders for years after the temples fell. Remember that sanctuary with all the Air Nomad relics that Aang discovered? It wasn't just some random collection, it was deliberately arranged to lure surviving Air Nomads by appealing to their cultural connection and desire to preserve their heritage. Why would the Fire Nation go through all that trouble for just one person they weren't even sure was alive? Even more suspicious are the wanted posters that appeared in various Earth Kingdom villages. If you look closely, some were dated 20, 30, even 40 years after the initial genocide. Many posters don't even mention the Avatar specifically, but refer to airbender fugitives using plural language, implying they were hunting multiple targets, not just Aang. The Fire Nation's record keeping reveals their obsession. The Fire Sages maintained incredibly detailed documentation of supposed Air Nomad sightings for almost 50 years following the attacks. They cataloged everything from witness testimonies to unusual weather patterns that might indicate airbending. This wasn't random paranoia, but a systematic tracking system following specific leads and movements of people they believed to be surviving Air Nomads. What's really telling is how Fire Nation military bases were positioned throughout their 100-year campaign. Outposts stationed near remote mountain regions had no strategic military value whatsoever. These locations didn't guard important supply routes or provide tactical advantages against other nations, but they corresponded perfectly to ancient air nomad migration paths and spiritual sites absent from common maps. These outposts were essentially ghost hunters' stations, watching for something the Fire Nation didn't want others to know they were looking for. When rumors of Aang's return finally spread, the Fire Nation mobilized instantly. Their response systems weren't created from scratch. They were already in place, as if they'd been waiting and expecting airbenders to resurface all along. Those Fire Nation protocols for capturing airbenders might not have been so far-fetched after all, because when we look at the actual geography of the Avatar world, we find something surprising. There are vast regions that remained completely untouched by Fire Nation control throughout the entire 100-year war. What if some Air Nomads simply disappeared into these forgotten corners of the world where even the most determined Fire Nation soldiers couldn't follow? Imagine hidden valleys and misty peaks beyond any map, places where airbenders could vanish without a trace. The world of Avatar is massive and largely unmapped. While our journey with Aang takes us through major settlements and key locations, we're seeing just a fraction of this expansive world. Remember the Foggy Swamp? This incredible isolated community of waterbenders developed completely separate from their northern and southern tribes. They created a unique bending style focused on plant manipulation found nowhere else in the world. Just as the Foggy Swamp nurtured this unusual form of waterbending in secret, the remote Air Nomad territories could shelter hidden airbender communities. The Northern Air Temple shows us this possibility. When Aang visited, he discovered Earth Kingdom refugees thriving in abandoned Air Nomad spaces. They developed gliding technology mimicking airbending abilities, allowing non-benders to soar through the skies. These refugees adapted to life in these unique temple environments, finding ingenious ways to use the ancient architecture for survival and even prosperity. What about those mysterious mountain ranges beyond the Siwang Long Desert. The show mentions these places as so dangerous and remote that even the Fire Nation won't go there. With treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, and dangerous wildlife, these regions offer perfect natural protection. Air Nomads could navigate these forbidden places through flight, giving them a tremendous advantage in establishing hidden settlements. The Storm episode reveals something crucial. Air Nomads regularly traveled far from their temples on spiritual journeys. Many weren't even at the temples when the Fire Nation attacked. Young monks seeking enlightenment, elders on pilgrimages, nomadic groups following ancient paths, all would have been scattered across the world when the genocide began. In the library episode, we see ancient Air Nomad texts referencing secret meditation caves known only to master airbenders. These sanctuaries were designed to be undetectable, accessible only through narrow air tunnels or requiring specific airbending techniques. Fire Nation soldiers would never find these places. The Patola mountain range surrounding the Southern Air Temple contains countless hidden valleys, concealed plateaus, and inaccessible caves where small airbender communities could establish themselves undetected. Their natural affinity for high-altitude living would make these remote regions perfect sanctuaries from the Fire Nation's reach. Beyond those isolated mountain regions, there's an even more startling possibility that challenges everything we thought we knew about the Air Nomad genocide. What if some survivors chose to vanish in plain sight? Throughout the series, we encounter characters with unexplained agility, unusual spiritual knowledge, and surprising connections to Air Nomad culture. Subtle clues pointing to survivors who mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. The most successful Air Nomad survivors would have completely transformed their identities. Think about what makes an Air Nomad immediately recognizable: the blue arrow tattoos, distinctive orange and yellow robes, shaved heads, and their airbending abilities. By abandoning these visible markers, survivors could disappear into other nations without raising suspicion. Guru Pathik presents a compelling case. When Aang meets him at the Eastern Air Temple, Pathik demonstrates an incredibly deep understanding of Air Nomad chakra philosophy. In the chakras, energy flows through our bodies the way air flows through caves. He explains with familiar Air Nomad terminology. His ability to go 40 days without food resembles the advanced meditation techniques of Air Nomad masters who could sustain themselves on spiritual energy alone. Have you noticed the freedom fighters led by Jet? These teenagers move through the forest canopy with extraordinary agility, leaping between branches with movements that hint at airbending heritage. Jet himself can fall from great heights without injury. Barely perceptible hints, akin to a well-hidden signature that most would overlook. Then there's the Mechanist at the Northern Air Temple. Despite being an Earth Kingdom refugee, he displays an intuitive understanding of Air Temple architecture and airbending principles. His wild hair would cover arrow tattoos, and his burns provide a perfect explanation for any unusual scarring. King Boomy demonstrates an agility that seems impossible for an earthbender his age, moving with a lightness that resembles airbending forms. And what about Tai Li, whose fighting style relies on extreme agility and an understanding of energy pathways that parallels Air Nomad teachings? The emotional cost of such disguises would be immense. Imagine sacrificing your entire cultural identity, abandoning spiritual practices, hiding your natural abilities, and raising children to suppress their heritage. These survivors would carry the weight of a dying culture while never being able to openly celebrate it. The genius of this disguise is its invisibility. By shedding their physical identity markers and teaching their descendants to blend in perfectly with other cultures, these Air Nomads would effectively disappear from history, visible only through subtle movements, spiritual knowledge, and unexplained abilities that most would never connect to the lost Air Nation. But what if we've been thinking about airbending all wrong? The Air Nomads may have been physically decimated, but what if their bending art never truly vanished? After all, the Avatar universe repeatedly shows us that the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds is far more permeable than we might think, especially for the Air Nomads, who were the most spiritually attuned of all nations. Think about it. The origin of all bending comes from the spirit world itself. Remember those ancient lion turtles we saw in the series finale? They were the original source of all bending abilities, gifting humans with the power to control elements long before the modern bending arts developed. These primordial creatures existed in both the physical and spirit realms simultaneously, showing how bending transcends physical existence. During the genocide, as airbenders were being eliminated, the essence of airbending likely retreated into the spirit world where the Fire Nation couldn't reach it. The air temples were built at spiritual crossroads where the veil between worlds grows incredibly thin. This perfectly aligned with Air Nomad philosophy of detachment and spiritual connection. Aang could communicate with past avatars at these sites because these temples functioned as conduits between realms. Through these spiritual nexus points, the fundamental energy of airbending remained intact even as its human practitioners disappeared. Zhong explains this concept in the Deserter episode when he tells Aang that bending comes from breath and spirit, the core of one's being. Airbending would be the element most likely to survive spiritually, given its connection to breath itself. Air is invisible yet ever present, like a hidden wellspring of spiritual energy that continues flowing even when unseen. Have you noticed how some spirits manipulate elements without being benders? The forest spirit Hei Bai creates powerful gusts without airbending forms. Spirits naturally maintain elemental affinities independent of human practitioners, preserving these energies in their purest forms. The Avatar world shows that knowledge persists through spiritual connections without requiring direct teaching. When Roku spoke to Aang about Avatar wisdom, he explained this cosmic preservation. The knowledge of airbending techniques could have endured in the spirit world, waiting for the right moment to return. Remember the mysterious fog in the swamp showing Aang visions of people from his future. Time operates differently in spiritually charged places. The essence of airbending existed in a spiritual pocket where 100 years passed in the physical world while remaining perfectly preserved in the spirit realm. The winter solstice episodes reveal how spiritual energies grow stronger during cosmic alignments, temporarily thinning the boundary between worlds. During these moments, lost energies leak back into the physical world, creating phenomena that Fire Nation soldiers might have mistaken for surviving airbenders. While spirit world connections offered one path to preserving airbending, the most glaring hole in the Last Airbender narrative comes from the show's own rules about how bending abilities manifest. If you think about it, the entire premise of Aang being the only airbender left in the world for exactly 100 years creates a massive statistical impossibility that directly contradicts the fundamental nature of bending we see throughout the series. Let's look at how bending actually works in the Avatar universe. The show clearly demonstrates that bending abilities appear randomly throughout populations rather than following strict genetic rules. Remember when Katara discovered she could waterbend despite being the only bender in her entire village? Her own brother Sokka had no bending abilities even though they shared the same parents. This random pattern isn't isolated. We see it consistently across all nations and communities. Consider how in The Fortune Teller, we visit Makapu village where earthbending talents emerge unpredictably among children, or how the twins Wei and Wing in the Metal Clan are both earthbenders, yet their sister Opal unexpectedly develops airbending abilities after harmonic convergence. The cosmic energies that grant bending seem to follow mysterious patterns rather than simple family lines, a phenomenon we'll explore more deeply when we examine the origin of bending itself. What's most telling is how entire bending disciplines can disappear, only to resurface generations later. The Southern Water Tribe had all their waterbenders captured or killed by the Fire Nation, except Katara, who was born with these abilities despite having no waterbending teachers around her. Her bending emerged naturally, proving that the cosmic energy of water found its way back into the tribe. So why wouldn't the same principle apply to airbending? How statistically probable is it that not a single child with natural airbending abilities would be born anywhere in the world during Aang's 100-year absence? With millions of people across this world, wouldn't probability virtually guarantee that at least a few children would have been born with an affinity for air manipulation? Perhaps these random airbenders did exist but suppressed their abilities due to fear of the Fire Nation. Or maybe they were quickly identified and eliminated before they could master their skills. A child accidentally moving air without training would be vulnerable and easily targeted. Alternatively, these individuals might have lived in isolated communities where their abilities weren't recognized as traditional airbending at all, developing unique variations similar to how swamp benders created their distinctive plant-based waterbending style without any contact with the northern or southern tribes. So what if the title The Last Airbender isn't meant to be taken literally at all? Think about it. Maybe Aang wasn't the last person who could manipulate air, but instead the last person who truly embodied what it meant to be an air nomad. The show constantly emphasizes how Aang carries the weight of his culture's traditions, philosophies, and spiritual practices. This perspective transforms Aang's journey into something deeper than defeating Ozai or mastering elements. He becomes a living vessel for air nomad wisdom that would otherwise vanish vanish forever. Remember how emotional Aang became when discovering relics from his people? Each artifact represented cultural knowledge he alone carried. When you rewatch the series, notice how Aang teaches Tenzin not just bending techniques, but meditation, vegetarianism, and respect for all life. Like a seed preserving a forest's future, perhaps Aang wasn't simply the last airbender, but the first of a renewed tradition, a distinction that changes everything about his story.